God versus Nature, Chapter 2. The ancient Greek rejection of mysticism leads to the birth of science. Pre-Greek civilizations as mystical. As we discussed in Chapter 1, religion addresses the genuine human need for an integrated set of answers to the basic questions: where am I? Who am I? How do I know it? What should I do? So it is not surprising to find that religion has been ubiquitous in history. In primitive religions across the globe, gods are everywhere, and observed natural events are explained by their actions. Thunder is caused by a sky god, such as the Germanic Thor. Flooding is caused by a river god, such as the Hindu Ganga. Earthquakes are caused by an earth god, such as the Maori Raumoko. Consider how a child, primitive or modern, develops cognitively. He first grasps cause and effect from his own actions. He closes his eyes and the world disappears. He drinks water and his thirst is quenched. He releases a stick and it falls. He acts, perceives the result of his action, and grasps the connection. He sees other people acting and he sees the results of their actions. He may easily overgeneralize from this and conclude that all things have minds like his that cause their behavior. Trees have minds that cause them to turn their branches toward the sun. Rivers have minds that cause them to flood or to dry up. Quote, when they turn to cause and effect in the external world, primitives and children left to themselves typically continue to interpret the causal processes they perceive on the model of their early personal experience. Projecting their own pattern outward, they think of causal agents in the external world, some or all, as being personal entities, and they construe causation as the expression of inner desires or intentions. The obvious historical example of such anthropomorphism is the animist ideas that even inanimate entities are ensouled things who act with ends in view. Unquote. This is a simple form of the religious view that a mind is the source of causality, a form that typically only occurs in primitive societies. The earliest records we have, which may in some sense be called scientific, come from the ancient cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia, which both go back thousands of years before the emergence of Greece. Both of these cultures made cognitive advances, which helped the Greeks to develop science, but we will see that neither of these possessed science itself, because neither had a scientific mindset. Egypt. The pyramids are dramatic evidence of the Egyptians' skill in large-scale construction and their ability to perform and apply geometric calculations. The Egyptians developed a simple numerical notation that had 10 symbols but was not position-based like our modern system. Using this system, they were able to solve simple problems of area, weight, and volume. The Egyptians also made simple astronomical calculations related to maintaining the calendar and aligning temples. The north face of the Great Pyramid at Giza is precisely aligned within 1/20th of a degree to the celestial North Pole, the point around which the rest of the stars appear to rotate. Their calendar served both agricultural purposes, when to plant the seeds, and religious purposes, when to perform ceremonies. Their skill in embalming revealed a rudimentary knowledge of human anatomy, and papyri have been found recording the possession of symptoms for diseases. But perhaps the most notable aspect of Egyptian civilization was its changelessness. Early in their history, Egyptians made a few key advances in mathematics, medicine, and calendrical astronomy. But over the course of 2,000 years, there were virtually no discoveries or advances in these fields. This extreme conservatism makes sense in light of the otherworldliness of Egyptian culture. The Egyptians had an elaborate and centralized state religion. The pyramids themselves are monuments to the Egyptian obsession with the world beyond death. Given the absolute importance of the other world, the Egyptians had little motivation for studying this world or improving their life on earth. Mesopotamia. The Babylonians developed a complex numerical notation that was both decimal and sexagesimal, based on powers of 60. Babylonians recorded word problems in which specific unknown quantities had to be calculated from known quantities. They compiled tables of multiplications, reciprocals, squares, and square roots as aids to their calculations. Babylonian priests compiled extensive records of the motions of the celestial bodies, records that would later be used by Greek astronomers. These priests made accurate mathematical calculations for planetary positions and times and compiled complex tables for prediction of celestial events, such as eclipses and lunar phases. They used these astronomical calculations to create a calendar based on the lunar cycle but also related to the solar year. The maintenance of an accurate calendar was crucial to the Babylonians for the same reasons as for the Egyptians, for agricultural and religious purposes. The Babylonians' medical practices, like those of the Egyptians, were strongly tied to their religion. According to historian Peter Whitfield, quote, "The overriding belief was that disease was caused by divine disfavor or demonic possession. This did not mean that the sick were not treated or thought to be beyond human help, but it did mean that no functional theory of disease emerged, and treatment was directed entirely to the symptoms. Several different professional groups were involved with medicine: the diviner, the exorcist, and the physician, and the practice of hepatoscopy, the examination of the liver of sacrificed animals, was the most important single means of diagnosis." Unquote. Ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian mathematics did not rise to the level of a science. Despite a proficiency in certain mathematical operations, there was no conceptual level mathematics with general propositions, theorems, or proofs. Moreover, according to Whitfield, quote, "Despite centuries of meticulous sky watching, there is no theory of the shape or mechanism of the cosmos. An intimate knowledge of the human body produced no theory of the functions of its organs, or even the concept of functional disease. The ubiquity of physical working against mass and weight did not invoke any language of physics. Their philosophy of nature led them to explain the world they saw by creating a parallel world that was unseen, a world whose laws integrated the realms of gods and men, life and death." Unquote. For both of these ancient civilizations, religion was the central focus of their abstract conceptual thought. Ancient Greece as the first non-mystical culture in history. The ancient Greeks had an unusual religion. They believed in the Homeric gods, but their gods were conceived of as powerful humans. As author Thomas Cahill points out, quote, "What is so striking about the Homeric gods is their lack of godliness." Unquote. These gods could perform morally wrong actions, and they did. There was no organized religion, there were no central authorities, and no canonical religious texts. The god had limits on their power. They had to work within the limits of reality. It was widely accepted that the world had always existed and that it did not need a god to make it come into existence. The most mystical aspect of Greek culture was the belief in oracles, which were most often consulted for major decisions. But oracles were considered fallible, and the Greek philosophers did not take them seriously. In both Babylon and Egypt, learning and specialized study of the observed world were only done by priests. In contrast to this, the Greek scientists were private citizens and teachers who had no courtly role or royal patrons to serve. According to philosopher Leonard Peikoff, quote, "Ancient Greece was not a religious civilization. The gods of Mount Olympus were like a race of elder brothers to man, mischievous brothers with rather limited powers. They did not create the universe or shape its laws or leave any message of revelations or demand a life of sacrifice. Nor were they taken very seriously by the leading voices of the culture, such as Plato or Aristotle. From start to finish, the Greek thinkers recognized no sacred texts, no infallible priesthood, no intellectual authority beyond the human mind. They allowed no room for faith. Men generally dismissed or downplayed the supernatural. There was a shadowy belief in immortality, but the dominant attitude towards it was summed up by Homer, who has Achilles declare that he would rather be a slave on earth than, quote, bear sway among all the dead that be departed, unquote. Ancient Greeks held that our central problem is the achievement of well-being in this world. Further, they held that we have the intellectual and moral capacities to solve this problem and to fashion a good life for ourselves by our own efforts. Whitefield has pointed out how the shallowness of Greek religion was responsible for the birth of Greek philosophy and science. Quote, having no profound faith in their gods, their intellect was free to explore realms of thought unknown to other ancient civilizations. The object of their study was physis, nature in its widest sense, and thus they became the first physikoi, physicists. The very word which they gave to this world, cosmos, meant in its original sense order, and this intellectual adventure seems to have sprung from the conviction that the world was an ordered system which would yield to rational investigation. Unquote. Historian of science G.E.R. Lloyd argues that the Milesian philosophers such as Thales made two significant intellectual accomplishments: the, quote, discovery of nature, unquote, and, quote, the practice of rational criticism and debate, unquote. By the discovery of nature, he means, quote, the appreciation of the distinction between the natural and the supernatural, that is, the recognition that natural phenomena are not the products of random or arbitrary influences, but regular and governed by determinable sequences of cause and effect. Many of the ideas attributed to the Milesians are strongly reminiscent of earlier myths, but they differ from mythical accounts in that they omit any reference to supernatural forces. The supernatural plays no part in their explanations. Unquote. Lloyd points out as an example the theory of earthquakes, which is attributed to Thales. Thales believed that the earth rests on water. He proposed that earthquakes were caused by the earth being rocked by wave tremors in the water. This account was extremely simple, but it made no reference to Poseidon or any other god. The pre-Socratic natural philosophers, such as Thales and Anaximenes, were looking for a single natural substance, or a few substances, that would account for all of the substances of the natural world. While the substances that they proposed, water, air, fire, etc., were naive, their search for the, quote, one in the many, unquote, was an important way to make sense of their experience. This type of search led Leucippus and Democritus to hold that everything consists of solid, impenetrable atoms, and Empedocles to conclude that everything consists of four elements: earth, air, water, and fire. For another example of the Greek naturalistic turn, we can look at the extensive body of medical writings known as the Hippocratic corpus. Associated with the 5th century physician Hippocrates of Kos and his followers, these writings cover a wide variety of medical subjects. Generally, in the Hippocratic writings, intervention by the gods was ruled out as a direct cause of disease. A Hippocratic work titled Airs, Waters, Places states that, quote, each disease has a nature of its own, and none arises without its natural cause, unquote. An excellent example of this is the way epilepsy was treated. Epilepsy had always been explained by reference to the gods, and it was known as the, quote, sacred disease, unquote. But the Hippocratic author of On the Sacred Disease rejected this view and started the work as follows. Quote, I do not believe that the sacred disease is any more divine or sacred than any other disease, but, on the contrary, has specific characteristics and a definite cause. Nevertheless, because it is completely different from other diseases, it has been regarded as a divine visitation by those who, being only human, view it with ignorance and astonishment. Unquote. Plato creates a philosophy based on the primacy of abstract forms. Plato and Aristotle, the two philosophical giants of Greece, created two dramatically different philosophical systems. especially in terms of their metaphysics and epistemologies. These led to two different attitudes toward the study of the natural world. Plato taught that the world we experience is not fully real, that the individual physical objects we see are imperfect, corrupted reflections of those in a higher reality, the world of the forms. In Plato's Republic, in order to explain his view of knowledge, he presents his famous myth of the cave. Quote, "Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place, with their necks and legs fettered, able to see only in front of them, because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Also behind them, but on higher ground, there is a path stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path a low wall has been built, like the screen in front of puppeteers, above which they show their puppets. Then also imagine that there are people along the wall, carrying all kinds of artifacts that project above it, statues of people and other animals, made of wood, stone, and every material." Unquote. In this case, the prisoners would naturally believe that the only reality is the shadows that they see. But, Plato then asks, what if a prisoner were freed from his bonds and compelled to stand up and turn around? Quote, "He would be pained and dazzled and unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before." Unquote. Eventually, he would grasp that the artifacts were more real than the shadows he'd believed were the only true reality. Then, if he were taken out of the cave into the sunlight, he would take more time to adjust to the light. Finally, he would see the sun. Quote, "And at this point he would infer and conclude that the sun provides the seasons and the years, governs everything in the visible world, and is in some way the cause of all the things he used to be." Unquote. If he then reminded himself, quote, "of his first dwelling place, his fellow prisoners, and what passed for wisdom there," unquote, he would, quote, "count himself happy for the change and pity the others." Unquote. In this myth, the flickering shadows represent the observable world that we live in. The objects that cast the shadows are the forms, and the sun is the form of the good, which is the ultimate source and sustainer for everything else. Peikoff summarizes Plato's metaphysics as follows, quote, "Reality is not the physical world of nature, not the imperfect sensible world of concrete men and things with its ceaseless flux of contradictions. Concretes, including individuals, are merely appearance, the distorted and ultimately unreal shadows of a higher, non-material, truly real dimension, the world of forms or abstractions, which is motionless, logical, and perfect. The forms are hierarchical, culminating in the pinnacle of reality, the ineffable form of the good. This form is what gives unity and meaning to the universe. It is the fundamental fact from which all the lower forms, and thus all the shadows, derive and on which they depend. And it is the fundamental value toward which all things aspire." Unquote. Plato created his theory of forms as a solution to the problem of universals, which can be stated as follows. Concepts, such as man, horse, justice, beauty, are abstract and general. The concept man somehow refers to all men everywhere, past, present, and future. But what exactly does man refer to? All the men we see differ in all of their attributes. They differ in intelligence, character, strength, health, size, and every other attribute. Plato's answer to this problem was that there is a single, eternal, perfect form of man, which exists in a world of forms, and that all individual men somehow participate in that one form. They are, in effect, shifting reflections of the form of man. So how can we come to know the forms, the true reality, according to Plato? Plato holds that in a previous life we were in touch with the forms, but on being born into this world we have forgotten them. In order to get back to them, we must somehow recollect them. Initially, some items in the visible world may allow us to start our recollection, but we must soon turn away from the shadows that surround us and train our minds to deal in eternal, timeless truths, such as the truths of mathematics. This is why Plato was an ardent supporter of the study of geometry. Because of his support for the study of geometry, Plato has often been esteemed as pro-science. But Plato's interest in geometry came primarily from its perceived ability to train the mind to ignore physical reality and come into contact with the forms. Plato did not see mathematics as a tool for better understanding the physical objects around us. Quote, "If we are ever to have pure knowledge, we must escape from the body and observe matters in themselves with the soul by itself." Unquote. In the Republic, Plato derogates the study of the starry sky as being too physical, too this-worldly, concluding with the advice, quote, "Let's study astronomy by means of problems, as we do in geometry, and leave the things in the sky alone." Unquote. Peikoff summarizes Plato's advice, quote, "Do not play the pointless game of the cave dwellers, such as empirical scientists, who look for order in the chaos of shadows. Do not look, but think by turning your attention to the a priori ideas comprising reality." Unquote. In spite of Plato's dim view of worldly knowledge, he did create a cosmology. In Plato's Timaeus, he presents an account of the creation and structure of the world, which he viewed not as actual knowledge of the physical world, which he regarded as impossible, but as a likely story. In the account, a master craftsman, the demiurge, has created the world by taking pre-existing chaotic material and trying to shape it according to the forms. Of course, being naturally chaotic, the material did not fully accept the forms. The Timaeus presents Plato's view on astronomy, cosmology, light and color, the elements, and human physiology. The Timaeus would later be translated into Latin by Cicero, and it would become influential in the Middle Ages. Plato was a Greek anomaly. He was too mystical for most Greeks. He held that in order to gain true knowledge, we have to disregard the observable world and turn our glance inward, into our own minds. This premise would grow even more prominent in the Neoplatonists, and later Augustine, who would hold that the forms are ideas in the mind of God. Aristotle creates a philosophy based on this world. Aristotle, in contrast to his teacher Plato, held that the objects of the physical world are fully real and thus worthy of study. Knowledge, he held, is gained not from groundless deductions and intuition, but ultimately from induction, from the study of the concrete, particular things we see, touch, smell, and hear around us. According to Aristotle, this world is real and worth studying for the knowledge it brings, from the beautiful stars in the night sky to the minutest details of slimy sea creatures. Aristotle held that, quote, "every realm of nature is marvelous," unquote. Not only was Aristotle's philosophy supportive of science, Aristotle was a scientist himself, and his impressive work in biology demonstrates a mind fully in touch with and keen on understanding the physical world. Aristotle's epistemology was very different from Plato's. Aristotle rejected the idea of a separate, higher realm of forms. He held that all knowledge is ultimately grounded in perceptual observations, and that forms are in the objects we experience. When we look at a group of similar objects, our minds are able to use the faculty of abstraction to grasp the common form of the objects. This is how we think abstractly. But at the same time, we understand that abstractions cannot exist apart from concrete objects. Immersed in the Greek culture that valued discussion and debate, Aristotle studied the many arguments that different thinkers gave for their views. Some arguments were clearly good, and some were clearly not. He set out to determine what all valid arguments had in common. This led him to develop an entirely new field of knowledge, the science of logic. Key to this science was the law of non-contradiction. There are no contradictions in reality. The same thing cannot both be true and false in the same respect at the same time. For Aristotle, according to Peikoff, quote, "The law of contradiction is not a pure tool unsullied by sense, but a plain description of observed fact. This law," he says, "is an absolute true of this or any other world. It is true in his famous phrase of being qua being, which is why compliance with it is a requirement of valid thought." Unquote. Implicit in the law of non-contradiction, but not explicitly stated by Aristotle, is the law of identity, which was stated earlier by Parmenides. A thing is what it is, and it is not what it is not. Whereas Plato held that true reality, the realm of the forms, is eternal and changeless, Aristotle opened his eyes and looked around him. He saw animals running, plants growing, clouds drifting, celestial bodies moving, and people doing a wide variety of things. Aristotle saw that change was undeniable, and he developed conceptual tools to understand the changes around him. Particularly powerful were his concepts of the potential and the actual. Earlier Greek thinkers had seen change as contradictory, but Aristotle simply saw it as involving a potential becoming actualized, given the appropriate conditions. An acorn is a potential oak tree. A boy is a potential man. A pile of stones is a potential house. Aristotle posited 4 types of cause or explanation: material, formal, efficient, and final. Consider a house. The material cause is the wood and bricks from which it was constructed. The formal cause is the shape or structure of the house. The efficient cause is the actions of the builders in constructing the house. And the final cause is the reason for which the house was built, to provide shelter from the elements. All physical things or substances are composed of 2 parts, which Aristotle called matter and form. The matter is the stuff, and the form is the structure. Whereas in the mind we may mentally separate the 2 aspects, in reality the 2 are inseparable. In reality, there is no such thing as pure matter without form, or pure form without matter. Whereas Plato saw the soul as something immaterial that was trapped in the physical body, Aristotle saw the soul as simply the form of the body. Aristotle's observational skills are most evident in his zoological works. He was a great observer of living animals. As described by Aristotle scholar Jonathan Barnes, Aristotle's History of Animals, quote, discusses in detail the parts of animals, both external and internal, the different stuffs, blood, bone, hair, and the rest, of which animal bodies are constructed, the various modes of reproduction found among animals, their diet, habit, and behavior, and he is particularly informed and particularly informative about marine animals, fish, crustacea, cephalopods, testacea. The history of animals ranges from man to the cheese mite, from the European bison to the Mediterranean oyster. Every species of animal known to the Greeks is noticed. Most species are given detailed descriptions. In some cases, Aristotle's accounts are both long and accurate. Unquote. Aristotle's biological research was focused almost exclusively on zoology. However, he inspired his student and successor, Theophrastus, to do similar detailed studies of botany. Being primarily interested in living things, Aristotle developed a teleological, goal-directed view of the world. but not in a way that involved anything mystical or religious, or inanimate entities having conscious goals. For example, he held that plants move their leaves in order to absorb sunlight, and rocks fall to earth, and water flows downhill to get closer to their natural place. But he did not hold that plants or rocks set conscious goals. Aristotle's cosmology came from theories of earlier Greek thinkers, integrated with Aristotle's own observations in his own philosophy. He viewed the earth as a sphere fixed at the center of the cosmos, with an atmosphere extending up near the moon. The moon and other celestial bodies are embedded in spherical orbs that rotate uniformly. Their motion is caused by some sense of a self-conscious, unmoved mover, which is the closest Aristotle came to a concept of God. Aristotle's unmoved mover is not aware of the rest of the universe, including us. The sublunar world is made up of 4 substances, which were, from Empedocles, earth, water, air, and fire. Each of these has its natural place, which it seeks out. Earth's natural place is the center of the cosmos, so when we drop a rock, it falls toward the center of the earth. These 4 substances, in various combinations, make up the numerous types of substances we experience. Most of Aristotle's physics and cosmology is now known to be incorrect. However, given the relatively primitive state of knowledge of Aristotle's time, it was a brilliant integration that explained a wide variety of phenomena. In order to fully appreciate Aristotle's scientific achievement, we must pay close attention to his underlying philosophy, especially his empirical view of knowledge. As Barnes notes, quote, "Our modern notion of scientific method is thoroughly Aristotelian. Scientific empiricism, the idea that abstract argument must be subordinate to factual evidence, that theory is to be judged before the strict tribunal of observation, now seems a commonplace, but it was not always so, and it is largely due to Aristotle that we understand science to be an empirical pursuit." Unquote. Peikoff argues that Aristotle made a fundamental advance in developing the law of cause and effect. Quote, "The meaning of Aristotle's theory is that each entity has a certain nature and, if not disturbed, acts only in accordance with that nature. In Aristotle's terminology, each entity has a definite, limited potentiality to actualize, and must therefore act, move, accordingly. When the actuality has been reached, the relevant motion ceases." The enduring essence of this view, long accepted by scientists who dropped the idea of natural strivings, is that the world is ruled by natural law, so that there are no chance events and no miracles. Even though Aristotle's statements on this topic are not always consistent, his theory is the first attempt in Western history to formulate, validate, and apply a universal law of cause and effect, and to do so in purely secular terms. Unquote. The scientific achievements of the Greeks. Because of their nature-centered approach to knowledge, the Greeks made numerous scientific advances in fields such as medicine, optics, mathematics, and astronomy. Medicine. We've seen how the Hippocratic works are predominantly naturalistic in their discussions of health and disease. One prominent naturalistic theory, the theory of the 4 humors, was first proposed in these writings. According to this theory, there are 4 essential fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which map to the qualities hot, cold, wet, and dry, and any imbalance in these fluids leads to pain and disease. When possible, according to these writings, the physician should attempt to bring these humors back into the proper proportions. Another significant development in Hippocratic medicine was the recognition of the value of elaborate clinical descriptions of diseased or injured patients, including their symptoms and behavior. Some of these writings present extensively detailed reports on particular patients regarding how their condition changed over time. These reports could help physicians predict the course of disease for future patients. After the Hippocratic writings, the next major developments in Greek medicine came during the Hellenistic period, after 300 BC, in the Museum of Alexandria. Officially a temple to the Muses and connected to the great Library of Alexandria, this was in actuality more of a research center where prominent thinkers came to study and discuss philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other subjects. It was the greatest research center of antiquity. There is evidence that several individuals associated with Aristotle's Lyceum, after Aristotle's death in 322 BC, were influential in founding or contributing to the Museum of Alexandria. This connection is not surprising, since Aristotle was the greatest ancient proponent of the study of the natural world. During the early Hellenistic period, an important field of research at the museum was anatomy and physiology. The most prominent leaders of this program were Herophilus of Chalcedon, 330 to 260 BC, and Erasistratos of Chios, circa 315 to 240 BC. They performed human dissections and vivisections of living animals, and perhaps even of condemned criminals, and put forth theories of physiology. Herophilus's anatomical investigations led him to numerous discoveries. He identified the heart's main chambers and the blood vessels going to and from them. He identified the brain, along with its main components, as the center of the nervous system. He distinguished between sensory and motor nerves. He dissected the eye and described its membranes. He identified the ovaries of the female body and compared them to the testes of the male. He also coined many anatomical terms that remain with us today. These include duodenum, which comes from the Greek words for 12 and fingers. Using his hands to measure its length, on average, it came to the width of 12 fingers side by side. The culmination of Greek medicine was achieved with the work of Galen of Pergamum, AD 129 to circa 216. Galen studied and practiced medicine in Pergamum and Alexandria, while working as a while for a surgeon to gladiators. He later went to Rome and acquired a reputation as a great physician, eventually becoming personal physician to Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius and later emperors. Galen was heavily influenced by the Hippocratic corpus, as well as the writings of Herophilus and Erasistratus. From the Hippocratic corpus, he took the idea of the four humors as the essential constituents of the body. Galen added the idea that a particular organ could be diseased from its own imbalance of the humors. Due to Roman prohibitions, Galen was not permitted to dissect humans, but he dissected a variety of animals, including monkeys. He became quite skilled at dissection and even wrote a how-to guide on the subject. His writings on the human body were extensive, covering anatomy, physiology, diseases, and treatments. As in some of the Hippocratic works, he did extensive observations of his patients. Galen created a physiological system in which the heart is the source of the arteries and pushes arterial blood out to the rest of the body. The liver produces venous blood, which also goes out to the rest of the body. The blood is consumed by the body. It does not flow in a closed loop. Although we now know Galen's system to be largely incorrect, it did make sense of his observations. Historian of science David Lindbergh summarizes Galen's accomplishments. Quote, Galen's medical system proved exceedingly persuasive, dominating medical thought and teaching throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. Part of its persuasive appeal lay in its comprehensiveness. Galen addressed all of the major medical issues of the day. He could be practical, as in his pharmacology, and theoretical, as in his physiology. He was philosophically informed and methodologically sophisticated. His work embodied the best of the Greek pathological and therapeutic theory. It contained an impressive account of human anatomy and a brilliant synthesis of Greek physiological thought. In short, Galen offered a complete medical philosophy which made excellent sense of the phenomena of health, disease, and healing." Unquote. Mathematics, Mechanics, and Optics. Whereas Egyptian and Babylonian mathematical writings generally discuss specific problems, such as how to calculate the area of a particular field with particular dimensions, the Greeks turned their focus to more theoretical issues, such as how to get the general solution for the area of any triangle, starting with fundamental definitions, axioms, and postulates. Consider the Pythagorean theorem. The Babylonians had recorded many Pythagorean triples, such as 3, 4, 5, where 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared. But it wasn't until the Greeks, and most probably the Pythagoreans, that this theorem was proved for the general case of all right triangles. One of the most famous Greek mathematical works is Euclid's Elements, which was written around 300 BC, probably in Alexandria. Euclid started with the works of earlier Greek geometers and integrated their discoveries into a deductive system of axioms, definitions, demonstrations, and proofs. Elements became, quote, "the most enduring and widely studied secular book in the Western world, dominating the teaching of mathematics for more than 2,000 years." Unquote. Another mathematical giant of antiquity was the creative genius Archimedes, circa 287 to 212 BC. Archimedes is known to have visited Alexandria, although his permanent home was in Syracuse, in Sicily. Archimedes' interests spanned arithmetic, geometry, optics, statics, hydrostatics, astronomy, and engineering, although his primary interest was geometry. In geometry, Archimedes proved numerous theorems relating, for example, the surfaces and volumes of spheres and cylinders. For example, that the surface area of a sphere is 4 times that of a great circle of the sphere, i.e. 4 pi r squared. He also made numerous applications of mathematics to physical problems, such as the determination of the center of gravity of various geometric shapes. He worked on finding areas and volumes of special curved surfaces and solids by relating them to more easily found results for triangles, cubes, etc. Some of his procedures involved infinitesimals and anticipate integral calculus. Archimedes' work on floating bodies presents his famous principle concerning the weight of fluid displaced by an object immersed in the fluid. As an engineer, Archimedes invented numerous types of geared and levered mechanisms, such as the Archimedean screw for lifting water, and the infinite screw for translating rotational motion into linear motion, and designed numerous war machines. 2 other famous engineers were Ctesibius of Alexandria and Hero of Alexandria, who invented water clocks and automatic machines powered by weights, compressed air, heat, and steam. Another mathematical giant was Apollonius of Perga, who flourished in 210 BC, who wrote a comprehensive and systematic treatise on conic sections, which are the plane figures created when a cone is cut by a plane. He named all 3 conic sections, the parabola, the ellipse, and the hyperbola, and demonstrated their fundamental properties and methods of construction. Another subject that intrigued the Greeks was the nature of light and vision. There were vigorous debates about the explanation of how we can see the world around us. Some argued that vision involved something emanating from the eye to external objects. Others, such as the atomists, argued that vision required something coming into the eye, and yet others argued for a combination of the two. In their studies of optics, the Greeks examined the nature of reflection, refraction, and various types of optical illusion, such as the use of perspective in 2-dimensional images. One of the earliest books on optics was written by Euclid, who did experiments with mirrors to demonstrate that the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. Studies were also done to see how images were formed on mirrors with curved surfaces, and how curved mirrors could concentrate light from the sun onto focused points. The astronomer Ptolemy wrote a book on optics, which described experiments he performed to measure the angle of refraction when light goes from air into glass, from water into glass, and from air into water. He then investigated the effect this had on the appearance of images and celestial bodies when seen through a refractive surface. In their architecture and artwork, the Greeks showed their awareness of various types of optical illusions. The 5th century scene painter Agatharchus of Samos created flat backdrops that looked three-dimensional, with more distant objects painted as smaller. This perspective technique probably did not match the sophistication of the Renaissance, but it was used in numerous relief sculptures and was discussed in Euclid's Optics, such as in his 5th proposition. Quote, "Equal magnitudes situated at different distances from the eye appear unequal, and the nearer always appears larger." Unquote. Astronomy. Of all of the scientific achievements of the Greeks, the most significant were in the field of astronomy. The creation of models of the cosmos started with Anaximander in the 5th century. Anaximander's model was extremely primitive, with the Earth seen as a cylindrical disk. But soon after this, Greeks, such as the Pythagoreans, started imagining the Earth as a sphere at the center of a spherical cosmos. Greek astronomers promoted the idea of circular motion as the key to the sky, and Greeks worked to explain more complex motions, such as that of the planets, in terms of uniform circular motion. The motion of the planets, such as Mars, was especially complex. In the course of moving across the background of the fixed stars, Mars would slow, stop, then move in the opposite direction a small distance, a, quote, retrograde motion, then slow, stop, and then resume its original motion. The first significant mathematical description of the heavens was given by Eudoxus of Cnidus, a student of Plato, in the 4th century BC. Eudoxus created a system of 27 spheres, all of which were centered on the Earth. In his system, the Earth is at rest in the center, and the axes of the different spheres are inclined to one another. They rotate at different, though uniform, speeds. With this model, Eudoxus was able to some extent, explain the strange motion of the planets. The combination of the motion of several spheres would, in principle, create the retrograde motion of the planets. The system of Eudoxus was improved upon by Callippus of Cyzicus, who added 7 spheres in order to account for several observational discrepancies. The systems of Eudoxus and Callippus were primarily mathematical and did not attempt to give a physical explanation of the circular motions. Aristotle took the model of Callippus and made it the basis for a physical system. He was concerned about the transmission of movement from one sphere to the next. He added a number of reacting spheres to cancel out the motions of some of the primary spheres, so that each sphere's motion relative to its neighboring spheres would be a simple circular motion. The resulting system had 55 spheres. One notable deficiency of these models was the observed fact that several celestial bodies appear to get bigger or smaller, suggesting that their distance from the Earth changes over time. This led Apollonius of Perga to put forth a system using epicycles, where the center of each circular motion is itself moving in a circle called its deferent. Once the Greeks had started thinking geometrically about the Earth and its relation to the celestial bodies, they were able to apply simple geometrical reasoning to infer certain numerical relations between them. For example, Aristarchus of Samos, circa 310 to 230 BC, measured the relative distances to the sun versus the moon using a simple calculation. When the moon was precisely half full and both the sun and moon were in the sky, he measured the angular distance between them. From this angle, he did a simple geometric calculation to determine how much farther the sun is compared to the distance of the moon. Due to the extreme sensitivity of this calculation on the precision of this angle, The result that Aristarchus calculated was off by an order of magnitude, but his geometric reasoning was flawless. Aristarchus also proposed that the sun is the center of the cosmos and that the earth orbits it in a circle. While for Aristarchus this was sheer speculation, his idea would later inspire Copernicus to create his own heliocentric hypothesis. As another example of this geometric reasoning, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, circa 285 to 194 BC, performed a simple, ingenious calculation to determine the circumference of the earth. Quote, observing a vertical column at Aswan in Upper Egypt, which lies on the Tropic of Cancer, at noon on the summer solstice, he noted that it cast no shadow. Some 500 miles north in Alexandria at the same moment, the shadow of a similar column formed an angle of 7 degrees to the vertical. Eratosthenes reasoned that therefore that 500 miles was 7 over 360 or 1 over 51 of the circumference of the globe. The result, approximately 25,000 miles, is within 6% of the true value. Unquote. The most impressive existing artifact of ancient Greek science and engineering is the Antikythera mechanism, which has been called the world's oldest computer. In 1900, a group of sponge divers discovered an ancient shipwreck off the coast of the Aegean island of Antikythera. Dated to approximately 70 BC, this wreck contained many statues and other artifacts, one of which was a severely corroded mass of bronze, apparently containing a geared mechanism with Greek inscriptions. Over the course of the 20th century, the object was X-rayed and analyzed numerous times. Each time, more of the mechanism's features were revealed. The most recent analyses were done in 2006 and 2008 using specialized CT scan technology. Researchers have concluded that the Antikythera mechanism was a precisely constructed astronomical calculator. It contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gear wheels housed in a small wooden box with knobs that a user could turn by hand. The device was designed to be used by someone who was not an astronomer. It was used to predict solar and lunar eclipses, the phases of the moon, the rising and setting of constellations, and other celestial events. Analysis of the Greek inscriptions suggested that the mechanism was connected to Syracuse, where Archimedes had lived. Archimedes was known to have produced geared mechanisms, but not of this scale of complexity. Due to the skill involved in constructing this device, it was certainly not the first of its kind. Most probably, some followers of Archimedes had worked on building devices like this, and the Antikythera mechanism was a result of a chain of developments. In her book on the ancient and modern history of the Antikythera mechanism, author Joe Marchant summarizes what the device could do. Quote, whoever turned the handle on the side of its wooden case became master of the cosmos, winding forwards or backwards to see everything about the sky at any chosen moment. Pointers on the front showed the changing positions of the sun, moon, and planets in the zodiac, the date, as well as the phase of the moon, while spiral dials on the back showed the month and year according to a combined lunar-solar calendar and the timing of eclipses. Inscribed text around the front dial revealed which star constellations were rising and setting at each moment, while the writing on the back gave details of the characteristics and location of the predicted eclipses. The mechanism's owner could zoom in on any nearby day, today, tomorrow, last Tuesday, or he could travel far across distant centuries. Unquote. The astronomical calculations performed by the Antikythera mechanism made use of cycles that had been identified in part from Babylonian astronomical records. The Greek astronomer who studied these records and created these calculations was Hipparchus of Rhodes, who lived in the 1st century BC, and is credited with the transformation of astronomy from a mainly theoretical science into a predictive one. Hipparchus severely criticized earlier Greek astronomers for the fact that their models did not precisely match astronomical observations. He dedicated himself to integrating the precise Babylonian measurements with the geometrical astronomy of the Greeks. Toward this end, Hipparchus compiled a catalogue of 850 stars and their precise celestial longitude and latitude. He discovered the precession of the constellations, which is the slow shifting in star positions due to a wobble in the Earth's axis. Hipparchus also invented the dioptra, an instrument for measuring the apparent diameters of the sun and moon. He also created a simple version of trigonometry, which he used to calculate the distance to the moon. Hipparchus probably also invented stereographic projection, which was an essential element of the astrolabe, and he possibly invented the astrolabe itself. The astrolabe was one of the most critical pre-telescope astronomical instruments, and was probably invented by Greek astronomers. It consists of a sighting element used to observe the altitude of a celestial body, combined with a representation of the sky to be used for computation. The pioneering work of Hipparchus provided an essential foundation for the work of the greatest astronomical systematizer of antiquity, Claudius Ptolemy. A Roman citizen of Greek descent, Ptolemy lived in Alexandria in the 2nd century A.D. Ptolemy expanded Hipparchus's star catalogue to include 1,022 stars, grouped into 48 constellations, with longitude, latitude, and magnitude, from 1 to 6 of each. Ptolemy's fame stems chiefly from his mathematical composition, which became known by its Arabic title Almagest, from the Arabic word for the and the Greek word for greatest. Almagest is a systematic manual that presented all the astronomy known to the Greeks. It started with simple mathematical and astronomical concepts and built on them step by step to explain the types of motions of the celestial bodies and how mathematical models could account for these motions and phenomena such as eclipses. The celestial bodies included the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, as well as the fixed stars, which were believed to lie on one sphere centered on the Earth. For each type of motion, Ptolemy proposed a geometric model, calculated the numerical parameters from observations, and then constructed tables enabling the prediction of specific positions and phenomena for a given date. Ptolemy's geometric models made use of the epicycles developed by Apollonius and added eccentric motions operating in conjunction with them. An eccentric motion involves an off-center point around which there is a uniform angular motion, which leads to a non-uniform circular motion. While this last element would be criticized by later astronomers because of its departure from uniform circular motion, it was necessary to achieve the high level of precision and predictive success of Ptolemy's system. And according to one historian of science, quote, "As a didactic work, the Almagest is a masterpiece of clarity and method, superior to any ancient scientific textbook with few peers from any period," unquote. Because of its tremendous and obvious value, it was the most influential work of astronomy until the De Revolutionibus of Copernicus was published in 1543. As we have seen, ancient Greeks made many impressive advances in a range of different scientific fields. While many of their theories are deficient by the standards of today's knowledge, we must remember that they started with a pre-scientific culture. From there, they got science started. They did perform experiments in a number of fields: music, optics, mechanics, physiology, and they did use mathematics in a number of fields: music, optics, mechanics, and astronomy. Of course, they did not systematize the use of mathematics in experimentation to the extent that would come in the 17th century with the scientific revolution. The ancient Greeks created science, and they could not have done so within a fundamentally religious culture. Essential for the creation of science was a specific view of the nature of reality, a specific metaphysics. As physicist David Harriman points out, quote, The impersonal metaphysics was the great and historically recent achievement of the Greeks, specifically of Aristotle's secularism and advocacy of reason. It was this approach that led to the clear Greek distinction between the animate and the inanimate, which included the fact that consciousness can belong only to the animate. Once the Greek approach was embodied in the mind of the West, causation could no longer be conceived in terms of the personal efficacy of supernatural agents. Thus did the objective view of cause and effect displace the anthropomorphic view that, at the beginning, had seemed to be merely an innocent extension to nature of men's own causal experience. Western civilization broadened the concept of cause by regarding personal efficacy as merely a subtype of it. This was a crucial precondition of the development of modern science. It amounts to bringing causality for the first time into the realm of reality and identity, i.e., to breaking its primordial bonds to mysticism. Unquote.